Hi guys, so we're going to get started with this basic React tutorial. We're going to be building a journal entry application using React. Before I do get started, this tutorial will assume that you have some basic familiarity with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, as well as a basic understanding of the DOM, the virtual DOM. I'll do my best to explain as we go along. And then also just some familiarity with ES6. We'll be using ES6 syntax throughout this tutorial and some of the features that come along with that, and I will also try and explain as I go along with that. You'll want to make sure before you do begin that you have Node.js and NPM, Node Package Manager, installed on your local machine. I'm running on Ubuntu, so I'll be using a Linux environment, and you can test to see which versions of Node and NPM you have by running the following commands. So node-v, and that'll spit you back the version of Node that you have. Preferably you'll want to have Node version 5.2 or higher for this tutorial. And then you can do the similar thing with NPM, run npm-v, and that'll tell you which NPM version you have. And what we're going to now do is actually get our boilerplate up and running. So we're going to run our first command, which will be npx create React app, and then the name of our application, which will be in this case, my journal app, just something simple. And this typically takes a few seconds to complete. And essentially, I myself am still learning React, but I'm finding it pretty awesome. At first, I was a little apprehensive about it only because it was some unfamiliar territory to me and it seemed incredibly complicated. But once you sort of wrap your mind around the component structure behind React, it's actually a pretty awesome library to work with, especially because out of the box, it comes with a lot of really useful and powerful tools that you wouldn't typically get if you were to set it up in another way, or if you were to try and create that same environment manually. And that's essentially the beauty of Create React App. It actually comes pre-configured with a lot of really useful tools, which we'll be availing ourselves of throughout this tutorial. And this run usually takes quite some time, so I'm stalling by creating some fake small talk between myself and whoever's watching this tutorial. Not really sure what else to do at this time. I could pause the video, but I think I'll just let the run complete. It's almost done. Almost done. Alright, and we're up and ready to go. So the next thing we can do is we can actually cd into our project directory. So in this case, it's going to be my journal app. And I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code for this tutorial. However, if you prefer a different code editor, such as Sublime Text, Brackets, Atom, those are all great code editors. I've used them all, but my preference is VS Code, so I'm going to be using that for this tutorial. And we're going to get our project up in our code editor by running the following command if you're using VS Code. And that'll just open up for us there. I'm going to get my command line back. And you'll notice here at the end of the run, it kind of gives you some other commands that you can run depending on what it is you're trying to achieve. One of the things I love about React is the live dev server that comes as part of the pre-configuration. And what we're going to do is we're going to run our start script, which is going to be npm start, and that'll open up the boilerplate project in our default browser, so I'm just going to let that open. Takes a few seconds. And what we have here is the boilerplate project in React. And we're going to actually be able to find that in our source folder, just like what it says over here. And in our source folder, if we navigate over there, we're going to find a couple of starter files, our starter style sheet, which is pretty much what's rendering to our browser. And we're also going to notice our main app component here. If I go in there. And this is what we're seeing in our browser. So because we're not really going to need this, I'm actually going to get rid of this. So we're going to go from our closing header tag all the way up to our opening header tag, and we're just going to delete all that. And then we're going to save. And when we do save, we're going to notice our browser is nice and white. And we're actually going to delete our style sheet and our logo because we don't need any of those either. And then one small change I'm going to make is actually we're going to be starting off with a class component for our main app component. So notice here how we have our function app. We're going to actually change that up and we're going to make it a class component. So I'm going to go class app extends component. And we're going to take away the brackets from there too. And within our class component, we do need to have a render method. So I'm going to just add a render method there, some curly braces, and I'm going to move this return statement or this return block into our render. And then I'm going to save. Now, we are going to get a compilation error because this component is not defined. We need to make sure we define that in our import statement. So we're going to go up here, just add a little bit of code here, and we're going to go component, which we're getting from our React library. Once we save, that'll take care of our compilation error. And just to make sure everything's working nicely, I'm gonna add an h1 header here, and we're just gonna call this my journal app. Save that, and we'll notice that that renders nicely to our browser. Now, just before we do get nitty-gritty into the code, I'm going to show you our index.js file. Now, here, this line on line 7, React DOM.render, you're going to notice that the app component is represented here as like an XML-like tag. So this app component is what's being used as our root. So it's essentially going to be where all our custom components are going to flow from as children of the app component. So anything that we want to render to our browser has to pass through this component. Otherwise, we're not going to see it. And we'll get a better understanding of that as the tutorial goes on. And what we're going to do as our first custom component is we're going to create a file by the name of entries.js. And inside of that entries.js file, we're going to run our first import. So that import is going to be the same import that we had from before. From our React library. And next what we're going to do is we're going to create our first custom class component. So that component is going to be where our journal entries will be held. So this component is going to be called our entries component. And every class component needs to start with the keyword class, and it will extend component from our React library. And inside the body of a class component, we do need to have a render method. And within that render method, we need to have a return. So to start, we're just going to return a single element. I'll return an h1 tag, and inside the h1 tag, actually, I'll return an h2 tag, just so we can see the distinction. So within that h2 tag, I'm going to say my entries. Now when you do save that, you're going to notice there's nothing new that renders to our DOM, only because we haven't actually given our root anything indicating that we're rendering something from our child component. So I'm going to go back into our main app component here, and I'm going to render our child component. So because this class component is called entries, we have to maintain that naming convention. So when I go into our main app component, I'm going to write the word entries here, and I'm going to make that a self-closing tag. And this is the way in which we represent components in React as we display them in our DOM, or as we render them to our DOM. Now when I save that, we're going to get another error, and the reason is because entries is not defined. Now in React, each component functions separately as a separate piece of the application. In order for us to create a relationship between the components, we have to find a way to create some sort of connection. In this case, we do that through import statements. So in our main app component, we're going to have to run an import here at the top. And we're going to import entries, which is the name of our child component, from our entries file. Now, again, in React, another assumption that that's being made here is that if we don't include a file extension, it's a JavaScript file. So in this case, because it's entries.js, we don't need to include a file extension. At the end of that, we can keep that. Now, that error goes away because we've defined entries, but now we have another error stating that entries does not contain a default export. We've imported entries into our main app component, but we haven't exported it from anywhere, so this can't be accessed by anything outside of its own or outside of itself. So we can go back into our entries component, and we can just add a line down here, default, or sorry about that, export default entries. And once we do that, our error goes away, and we notice here that our child component is now rendered to our DOM underneath our main app. And just to show you what that looks like, down here in our div, we've got our header, my journal app, and then our entries component here. And within that entries component, if we go back into our file, we'll notice that this is what we see. So that's just some basic understanding of component structure in React. And now next what we're going to do is I'll just add a couple of extra lines here. So I'm going to move this down, and because we're adding some extra lines to our return statement, we're going to need to use round brackets that wrap those extra lines. So I'm going to just keep that there. And underneath, I will add a paragraph tag. And in the paragraph tag, we'll just add something simple. Maybe just some lorem ipsum text for now. Okay, there's a little error there. Yes, reason being because we need to actually wrap this inside of a single element. So I'm going to wrap this inside of a div. And we'll move that over inside of our single div. When we return in React, we can only return single elements. We can't return multiple elements, so what we can do is wrap our multiple elements within a single div, and that takes care of that issue. So now we see that we've got our hard-coded journal entry or filler text with our header and then the header of our app above that. So we've just created our first custom class component in React. And just a few small points to mention. When we are representing components in our app or in our main root component, we represent components like this with a capital letter, the same way we have our class name. And that all kind of comes together to be a sort of naming convention that works within React. And this is also a way to distinguish custom components from regular HTML elements. For example, or actually above this component, you can see the h1 tag starts with a lowercase h, whereas the component name starts with a capital E. So this is kind of your way of distinguishing between HTML elements and React custom components. So next what we're going to do is we're going to stay inside of, we're going to go into our entry component. So I'm going to just indent those. And we are going to create our first simple component. So this simple component will actually place above our class component. And we're going to call this entry, we're going to save it inside of a const. I'm going to call this entry header. And this is some ES6 arrow function syntax. And in the body of that, we are going to return our header element. So actually I don't need round braces. So we're just going to return a single header. I will make this an H3. And inside the H3, I will just say the word title. And then we're going to create an additional simple component which will represent the body of our journal entry. So const entry body. It's going to be the same type of thing here. And within that entry body, we're going to return a few elements. So because it's going to be a few lines, I'm going to actually use round brackets and I'm going to nest that inside of a div. And this we will call, let's see, I'll put some p tags in there, some more lorem ipsum text, and we will make maybe small tags, put a date here. So right now we're just playing around with some hard coding to get an understanding of the landscape that we're working in. And what we're now going to do is we're going to render our simple components. So what we can do is we can actually take our entry header and our entry body and we can represent those inside of our entries class. So down here, we will take the same name, entry header, and then we will make that a self-closing tag. And then we do the same thing with entry body. And we save that. And we'll notice that that renders nicely to our browser. I'm actually going to take away these hard-coded lines now. In fact, I'll just take away the p tag. I think that makes more sense. Okay. So one little thing, in this situation, we could technically separate these two components into separate files, but sometimes in the case of a simple application like this, we don't really need to break every component up into its own file. We can contain some components that have sort of a relationship with one another or have to do with one another. Those can stay within one file. One thing I do like about React is that it's very unopinionated, so you don't have to stick to any specific structure when it comes to the organization of your code or the organization of your components. Much different from something like Angular, which is very opinionated. It kind of tells you where things go. React kind of gives you that flexibility to build as you see fit. Of course, there are best practices. In this case, we're okay to keep these components in here because they're very simple components. Nothing too crazy going on in this app as a whole. And just a couple other small points about class components. They need to include a render, and the return can only have one parent element. So if you notice over here, this return has a parent element known as the div, and because there are multiple lines here, we've used those round brackets like I mentioned, and there does need to be a render method here. That's what makes this a class component, and that's what makes it different from a simple component. Simple components are essentially functions that return something. So essentially what we've just done is we've created a couple of simple custom components and a custom class component. We've rendered those into our DOM by sort of nesting components in one another and rendering them to our main app component. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to start understanding props and how props in React work. Alright, so moving on, we now have our entries component, and the data that we have in this component is hard-coded. One of the things about React is that React is about handling dynamic data. The way in which React handles data is what makes it so powerful and so amazing to work with, depending on what it is you're trying to achieve. And we can pass data around in what we refer to as properties, or props for short, and we can also use state. State we're going to get to in a little bit, but for now we're going to start understanding how props work. So we're going to be handling this data with props, and what we're going to do is we're going to remove all the hard-coded data that we've put in our body, in our entry body. I'm actually going to take that out now. And when we save that, we're going to see it removed from our DOM. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go into our main app component, and we're going to create an array of objects. That's going to be within our class here. Give myself an extra line. And this will be in the form of a const. So this const we'll call entries. And we're just going to create a few filler objects. So it'll have a title. The title we'll call my first entry, and then we'll give it a body. The body we'll call this is my journal entry. And because I don't really like to type repetitively, I'm going to copy and paste. I'm going to change up a couple things here. So second entry, third entry, and we'll save that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to pass this data we've just created, this hard-coded data, we're going to pass it through to our child component. So our child component here is our entries component, and we're going to use props to pass that data through. So you can kind of think of it as passing data through using attributes. We can call the prop whatever we want, as long as it's not a reserved keyword in React. So in this case, we can call our prop entry data, and we're going to pass that into our child component by going into our app. And this will be, so where on line 23 where I have my the representation of my, or the reference to my entries component, I'm going to go in here before the closure of the tag, and we're going to pass in the name. So in this case, entry data, and within that entry data, we're going to set it equal to the variable up here on line 6, and that variable entries is what we're going to put inside of our curly braces as a JavaScript expression, because in this case, anything that we use in JavaScript that we want to pass into our component gets used as an expression. So we have to nest it inside of our curly braces. So I'm going to save that. And now what we've done is we're taking this data and we're passing it through to our entries component. So we have to now access it from the other end. We have to go back into our entries component and we have to create that connection. So within our render method here, I'm going to go down here and we're going to use ES6 destructuring syntax with our curly braces here, and we're going to say entry data, not entry date, entry data, and we're going to set that equal to this dot props. And this is our way of defining the prop. I'm going to save that, and then we're going to go a little lower down to our entry body, and we're going to pass that in. So that's going to be entry data, which will now be equal to entry data, which is what we declared as our prop a few lines above. Entry data. So now the data that we're storing is represented in our virtual DOM. And basically the virtual DOM is compared to our actual DOM. Any changes that happen in our virtual DOM will then be rendered, will be rendered into our actual DOM. So the efficiency with React is that it doesn't actually take our real or actual DOM and re-render the whole thing every single time there's a change. It only takes into account the changes in our virtual DOM, makes that comparison to our actual DOM, and only those elements in the DOM are what get updated. So that's what makes React so efficient. Now we're gonna stay in our entries component, and we're going to pass, so essentially what we've done is we've passed in our prop, and this is being done here on line 23. So this prop is being passed to our entry body component. Now what we're going to end up doing within our entry body up here is we're going to now map through the array of objects that we had declared within our main app component. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another const. This is going to be above, and before we do that, I'm just going to take away these brackets, and I'm going to actually pass props in as our argument so we can have access to that. And within the body, we're going to create a const. This const is going to be called, let's see, we'll call this lines, and we'll set that equal to props dot entries data, and we're going to map over that. And we're going to pass in two arguments. The first argument is going to be our local variable, so it's going to be each line that we're mapping over, and then we're also going to have an index. The index will become more relevant in some moments, so I won't talk too much about that right now. And we're going to have our arrow function, and then inside the body of that, we're going to return our elements here, and this, in this case, we're going to return the following. So I'm just going to create a single div, and within the div I will wrap, let me see, we will have an h2, an h2, and this h2 will have within curly braces we will have line dot title, and then we will have within p tags and curly braces line dot body. I believe that's what I called them. Let me just double check. Oh, we get some errors. Okay, let's see what happened here. Okay, so in entries.js, all right, what did we do here? Okay, I see what I did. Little spelling error there. So I'm going to take that out. And then we're saved. All right. So now we are rendering our hard-coded data, or we have set up a situation where we can render our hard-coded data to our DOM. And what we're going to do is now we're going to go into the return of our simple component, and we're going to now render this variable we've declared on line 8. We're going to actually place that here, and remember your curly braces because that does count as a JavaScript expression. So we'll put lines here, and then we see our hard-coded data render to the DOM. So this is the mapped over array of objects that we had hard-coded previously. So nothing too crazy going on just yet, but we do see that things are starting to come into place. So all of our data has now been loaded in. Now, there is an index that we need to make sure we account for here. So I'm going to be putting in a key, and I'll set that equal to the index. We're not really using this right now, but each entry is going to be assigned an index based on this, and that's going to help us in the future when we're looking at manipulating certain things, when we're looking at managing our state. So we've now moved on to a more effective way of handling data rather than hard coding it and literally putting hard-coded data in HTML elements and rendering those to our DOM. We've managed to create a situation where we can actually pass props from our parent to our child and render our data or handle our data that way, which is definitely more efficient. But this is still just read only. Essentially, we're reading our array of objects from our main app component, and we're rendering it via props, which it is definitely more efficient, but in this case we are going to be looking at wanting to work more with dynamic data. So that's where we move on into state and state management, which is another part of the power of React. So what we're going to do now, and just a quick explanation of state, you can kind of look at state as any data that needs to be saved and modified without necessarily being added to any sort of database. In this case, we're not working with a backend. React is entirely front end. And because we're not working with any backend or any database, we're not saving any of this data. This is all just being rendered through our DOM and managed via props and state. One of the beautiful things about React is that there is a way that you can handle data on your front end without actually having to save it to a database. Now, in this situation, we're going to be creating these journal entries through or more dynamically, and then those journal entries will also be removed. If you choose to remove them from your DOM, you will have that ability to remove them. And in order for us to do that, we'll need to incorporate state within this application. So to get started with that, we're going to go into our main app component, and we're going to create a state object. So that's going to be done over here, just directly underneath. We're going to create just an empty object. Now this object is essentially going to contain all the properties for everything that we want to store in our state. So in this case, it's going to be our entries. So we're going to do a little bit of refactoring. I'm actually going to take this entire variable or this entire array. I'm going to cut that out and I'm going to move that into our state object, just like that. Now this isn't going to make much sense right now, so we're going to have to do a little bit of refactoring. I'm going to take away the equal sign and then take away the const. I'm going to save that. Now entries is not defined at this point in time because we do need to define it with respect to our state. So hence the error here. I'm actually going to open this up and make it full screen. Now essentially what we have here is state.entries. That is going to be how we will be able to work with the data we have in our state. And since we want to be able to remove entries from our diary or from our journal, we're going to create a remove character method, and that's going to be contained in our parent app class. So we're in here already. So within this class, we're going to, I'll go underneath and we're going to create our remove entry method. And this will be a function, and it will accept an index as its argument. This index will be the index of your respective entry. So in this case, we have 3 entries contained in this array. So any one of these entries will be assigned its own index, and that'll be what we're passing into this remove entry function. And we're going to make this an arrow function, so I'm just going to add the arrow there. And within the body of this, we're going to start off by declaring our state. So this is going to be destructuring syntax once again. And in here, we're going to call this entries. And this entries is actually being taken from line 6. So I'm just going to create a space there. And this will be set to this dot state. I'm going to save that. And then underneath that, we're going to want to set our state. So our initial state within the remove entry function is going to be the state that we've set to this hard-coded array. And we're then going to want to set our state to be a filtered version of that array, and the filter function in JavaScript is actually very useful. Essentially what it's going to do is it's going to create a copy of this array that we have here, except that copy will be a filtered version. So we're going to first write out our code and then I'll explain it because it's hard for me to talk and code at the same time. So we're going to go entries, and it's going to be entries.filter, entries.filter, and it's going to be a single entry that we're going to accept as an argument plus an index, and then this is going to be an arrow function, and we're going to create a body for that function. And what we're going to do, essentially what we're doing here is we are making a comparison. We are testing each index of this array against the index that has been selected for removal from the DOM. So this index is going to represent the single entry that we are looking to remove. We're going to compare it to the rest of the entries. As long as those the rest of the entries don't match that selected index, those indexes of those entries will be returned in the copied filtered array. And we'll get a better understanding of this once we actually start interacting with the DOM through our application. So there's our remove entry function. So the useful thing once again about the filter method is that it doesn't actually mutate the array, which we don't want this to be mutated. We want it to be preserved, and we want to just create a copy of it. So what it's going to do is it's going to create a new array, and then that's where we get to modify it. rather than modifying the original array directly, we're going to create a copy and we're going to modify that instead, which is the better practice in JavaScript. So now we have this function here that we need to pass through to our component. And then we're going to render a button next to each of the entries, which will then invoke that remove entry function. So we're going to pass that as a prop to our entries. I'm just going to make sure I save this. So we're going to go into our entries file here, and we're going to pass that as a prop to our entries. Sorry, I'm in the wrong file. We're going to go into our main app component, and we're going to pass that as a prop. So that's going to be the second prop that we pass to our entries child component. And we're just going to call that remove entry. And within our set of curly braces, we're going to call this dot, we're going to say this dot remove entry, just like that. So that's invoking the function there. Now, we are passing this function down to our entry body from our entries class component. So we're going to have to pass this through again as a prop, just like we did previously with the entry data prop. And that's essentially what we've done here. And then we're also going to have to do a little bit of modification here. So because we have components with their own state in our project, we're going to also have an additional component that's going to handle form data, the form input data. And we'll be creating that component in a moment. Before we do that, we're going to have to actually do a little bit of refactoring, because now we're going to turn our entry class component and make it into a simple component, because it's just going to be a better practice going forward. So here, I'm going to take away our class keyword. In fact, I'm going to change that to a const. And then instead of extends, we're going to take all that away. And we are going to pass in our props as an argument here with our arrow function. And because this is now a simple component, we no longer need our render. So I'm actually going to take away the render. Let me just take that part away and take away our extra brace. I'm going to save that. And now we're going to add our additional prop. And this is going to be the remove entry. The remove entry prop. Just like that. I'm going to save that. Getting a little dry. Just need a glass of water there. Okay, so that index we previously defined up here on line 10 is now going to start to become relevant as we start to handle our state within this application. In the table body component, or in the entry body component, sorry, we are going to be passing the key index through as our parameter. The filter function will understand this index based on that. And we're going to actually add a button to this block here that will represent the remove entry functionality, which will allow us to delete entries from our journal. So within this div element, we're actually going to add a button element, and this is going to have an on-click function. And that on-click function we will place inside of curly braces, and then round brackets to represent an arrow function. And then we will have our props and it's going to invoke that remove entry function, which will accept an index as its argument, just like we created it to, and then the body of this button will be our delete. I'm going to actually move this over so we can see what's in our DOM. Okay, so entries is not defined. Okay, so let's see what we did here. Okay. Oops, that's wrong there. Ah, okay, and this is where we went wrong here. So this dot state, because we're accessing this from our state. When I save that, oh, okay, so now we've got another. Okay, I see what we did here. So I actually left out a line. We need to declare our state here using destructuring syntax once again, and this entries here, this dot state is where this is still going to throw an error because I need to now take this out, this line out. Okay. Oh, and this, few small typos there, and there we are. So just a few small typos we had to fix there, and now we're back. So now you'll notice that in our DOM we have managed to render our hard-coded journal entries here, and each journal entry now comes fitted with its own option to delete. So if I was to delete from here, oh, looks like we get another error. So let's see what we did there. Ah, okay. So here we have not passed in our remove entry, and that is where we end up falling out of line. Okay, perfect. So now that we've passed in remove entry as our additional prop, we are able to officially delete diary entries from our DOM. If I want to delete them all, I could. But because we're not working with a backend or a database, these changes are not made permanent. If I simply refresh the browser, then we end up with our entries as good as new. So now the next thing we're going to do is create our form component, because since the goal here is to handle dynamic data, we are going to want to do that by way of collecting inputs from form. So we have our data being handled by the state so far. We can remove diary entries from our DOM, and in essence we are manipulating the state of our main app component. But we want to be able to add new data to our state and maybe manipulate that data more dynamically. So in this case, instead of playing around with hard-coded data, we're actually going to remove all that hard-coded data, and we're going to do that by going into our main app component. We're just going to simply take all of this, and now we're going to save that and watch it disappear from our browser. And we're going to go ahead and create a form component. So this form component we'll do by adding a file into our directory called form.js. And in here, we're going to run our usual import statement. This is going to be import React component from React. And we're going to just create a custom class component by the name of form. I'm just going to extend component. And within that body, we're actually going to now create a constructor, which will accept props as an argument. And within the body of that constructor, we're going to need to use the word super. This sets up our constructor properly. Without this, we won't be able to get our class to work appropriately. So underneath that, we're going to create our initial state. Oops. Our initial state in this case is going to be empty form fields. So our first form field is going to be our title. We're going to set that to an empty string, and then the second form field is going to be our body. We set that to an empty string as well. And then underneath that, we're going to take our state and we're going to reset it to our initial state. So this is going to be how we take whatever state is in the form and reset it back to our initial state after that form submission has taken place. So we're going to save that. So essentially the goal of this form is going to be to update the state of the form every time a field is changed in our form. So when we submit, the data that is taken in by the form will then get passed to the app's state, to the main app component state, and then that will update our entries component. So we're going to make a function here that's going to run every time there is a change made in the input, and this event is going to be passed through and will set the state of the form to have a name and then a value of the inputs. So we're going to call this method handle change, and that's going to be done under here. So handle change. We're going to pass in our event as our argument, and we're going to make that an arrow function. And within the body of that function, we're going to set a constant. These constants will be our name and our value. And then we're going to set our state, and that's going to be done by taking our name and we're going to set that to our value. I'm going to save that. So the two properties will essentially be coming from our state, and then those will be assigned to the values that will correspond to the form keys. So we're going to run the handle change method as an on change of the input, and then we're going to export our form component as well. So exporting our form component once again will allow the other components to have access to that form component if they need it. So within our render, which will happen underneath here, we're going to create our form. So this will be a const, that'll be our name, or in this case our title actually rather. And our title, and then our body, and we're going to set those to this dot state, and then we're going to return our form element. So here we're going to need our round braces or round brackets, because we have multiple lines, and then we're going to create a form here. I'm actually going to take away that, we don't need that. And then we're going to have our label, our first label in this case. I don't need the auto correct. Our first label in this case will be our title, and then our input will be text. And we're going to add a few extra attributes to this input field. So we're going to also add our name, which will be called name. Oops. And then we're also going to add an ID by the name of name. And then our value, in this case, will also be the name, which is taken as the input from the form. And then below that, we're going to invoke our onChange method. And in here, we will write this dot handle change. And then next, we're going to, so I'm just going to do a little bit of copy and paste here. I'm going to copy that, go underneath. And we're just going to change up a few things here. So we will call this a text area field, and then this name will then become, so this name will be called our body, and this ID will also be called our body, and this will also be called our body as well. And then finally on the very bottom, we'll want to make sure to not forget our default export. Oops. And within our main app, we're going to go back to our main app and we're going to render this form just below our main entries child component. So that's going to be capital F, self-closing, form is not defined. So in this case, we need to actually run an import to ensure that we bring in the form that we exported. Unexpected use of name. Okay, so I may have messed something up in the other in the form component. So unexpected use of the word name. So let me see. That's on line 33. Okay. So instead, value is going to be, oops. There we go. So now there's just one last thing that I forgot. As you can see, there isn't a label for our second form field. So I'm going to actually add that above my input. Oops. Okay. So label, and then within that, okay, and then within that we're going to call that entry, and then we get to see that there. So let's call the title of our first entry, there's a few things I did not do properly here, so we're going to make that title. We're going to call this title as well. There we go. And then this entry should also, perfect. And a couple more things I actually want to add here. We're going to add a placeholder here as well. We'll call this placeholder enter title, maybe enter title, and then the entry placeholder, let's see what we can put there. And let's make our first entry. So title of our first entry we can call maybe hello world, and I love the world. I guess I'm a bit of an optimist. Oops. So now we have a form that can accept data, but we just don't have a submit button. So our last step essentially is to create a submit functionality within our application. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a handle submit function within our main app. So we're going to go over to our main app, and we can place this underneath our remove entry function. So we're going to call this handle submit, and we will pass in an entry, so the respective entry that we're creating, and we'll make that an arrow function, and then we will create a body to that function, this dot set state. So the entries, and essentially what we're doing is we're taking the entries array and we're now setting our state to become a new array which now has the added entry placed inside of that array. So now our array of entries goes from being empty to being filled with the entry that has been created. That sounded like a bunch of gibberish, but so here what we're going to do is create an array, and we're going to use the spread operator in ES6, which is used for arrays. Basically takes an element and spreads the elements of, or okay, I'm going to rephrase. It takes an element that is an array and spreads those elements into single pieces. So essentially, this spread operator will represent the building of an array from each journal entry that we're creating. So we're going to go this dot state. Okay, we're going to go entries. And it's going to then take a second argument, which will be the entry that we're creating. So in this case, the entry that we're creating upon this submission is going to then be what's added onto our array of entries. So I'm going to save that. Now we want to make sure we pass this handle submit function as a parameter on our form component. So we're going to go back into, or not back into, we're going to go down, and you'll notice here we don't have any props being passed through this component. So we're now going to pass in our handle submit, and the handle submit will invoke that handle submit function. So once again, the name of this can be really whatever we want. I mean, typically in React we want to keep things consistent and we want to also make them meaningful. So I'm calling this based on whatever function we're invoking in this case, which I've kind of done as a pattern. It's good to respect those patterns because in programming it's very easy to forget things or to forget why you did things. So in this case we're going to go this dot handle submit. And for those who are new to React, I didn't mention this previously, but the this keyword tends to be the source of a lot of confusion for people. This basically is just referring to the context that we're in. So in this case, the form component or the form class is our context, and this is now going to essentially be where we're invoking this handle submit function. So the handle submit is being taken from our parent component, and we're going to be passing that in as a prop to our form class. So the handle submit is being invoked within the context of our form class, essentially. So now we save that. And our next step will be to go into our form class here, and we'll want to create a submit form function. And we can do that underneath our handle change. So the handle change, okay, so we're going to create our submit form function. This will be an arrow function. This dot props dot handles submit. This dot state. This dot set state. This dot initial state. So essentially what we're doing here now is we're taking our state which is, so this, whatever the state of the form is what we're going to, so whatever the state of the form is will be what we pass in as an argument to our handle submit function. Once that submit function is invoked, once that handle submit function is invoked, it'll then set that state back to the initial state, which, as we had done before up here on lines 7 through 9 or 7 through 10, we set those to empty strings. So it'll just set those back to those empty strings. So finally, we need to add a submit button into our form. So, and within that button element, we're going to create an on-click event, so that when we click on that button, it'll invoke the handle submit functionality. So within our form, what we're going to do here, I'll do this underneath the form and create a button element there, and that button element will have an on-click and inside we're going to just call this submit. Oh, there's our button, and the on-click will be set to our submit form. There we go. And that essentially completes our application. So now we're going to test things out a little bit. Let's have a look and enter a title. I'll go with Hello World again, why not? And I love the world. Okay. Okay, so there's just a few things I had to move around there. So our button element is going to be underneath our form, and I've wrapped our button and our form in a set of div tags to maintain that consistency there. And now we're ready to test out our application. I'm just going to save that, and we're going to refresh this. We can test things out a little bit. So I'm just going to add our Hello World title. And there we see our initial entry render into our DOM with our delete button. If I decide to go again and let's say we submit, we now have our second journal entry. We can also delete from the DOM. And if we refresh, we get back to our original state. So this essentially completes the app. If you would like to stay a little longer, I will be styling this app using Bootstrap and React. I'm going to do that in a separate portion. So you can continue with the tutorial and basically join me as I add some styling, make this look a little prettier than it already is, of course. And then I will be also placing a link in the description with the full project code. So if you are looking for that, I can place that in the description for you. And if you do have any suggestions or anything, any questions, feel free to throw those in the comments as well. Very much appreciated. Hopefully you've enjoyed this tutorial. I'm going to be doing a few more tutorials similar to this in the React series, and then I'll move on to do some other stuff, maybe some more advanced stuff.